Today on Inside the Issues, I speak to Dr. Bessma Momani about the ongoing conflicts in Syria and Egypt. Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Inside the Issues, a CG Online podcast. My name is Dr. Andrew Thompson. I'm an adjunct assistant professor of political science at the University of Waterloo and program officer at the Balsley School of International Affairs. Every week on the program, we're joined by an expert in international public policy, global governance, or some other aspect of international affairs. Today, we're joined by Dr. Bessma Momani. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Dr. Momani is a senior fellow here at the Center for International Governance and Innovation, and associate professor of political science at the University of Waterloo. I wonder if we might start with the situation in Syria. As you know, the conflict has been going on since 2011. Is there any end in sight to the violence, at least in the short term?
Well, I probably don't have a crystal ball, but I think that there are, some would say, some positive signs and some negative signs. Let's start with that. I guess on the positive side, we're seeing a coordinated effort at the international level. Both the Russian Sergei Lavrov as well as John Kerry have really put a lot of personal investment into this. We're seeing now the coming to terms of perhaps including the Iranians as well, at least as an observer status in the negotiations, in the discussions coming up in Geneva 2, set to take place on January 22nd. So that some would point to as a positive thing. Perhaps there may be some pressure, particularly on from the United States, on the Syrian National Council or coalition to actually attend. So that all sounds as though maybe there's hope, and I've heard of rumors of things as humanitarian corridors or safe zones for people, perhaps a ceasefire in Aleppo and other areas. These are all potential good signs or good things. The negative is that, in fact, the Syrian National Coalition probably doesn't have a lot of control on the ground. And in fact, what we're seeing on the rise is increasingly sort of a warlord kind of situation where many different little cities and towns and villages are being run by different kinds of militias that are not under any central control. We've had increasingly the rise of Al-Qaeda forces. These are not necessarily directly tied to Al-Qaeda, but they're sort of affiliates, or they're almost like a franchise of Al-Qaeda, particularly ISIS, the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, and to a lesser extent Al-Nusra Front, which is also an Al-Qaeda affiliate. And these two have taken on a greater amount of control, particularly in the eastern part of Syria. And some would say that's awfully troubling. Obviously, it does mean that there's less territory under the control of the rebels that are of the secular Free Syrian Army, and that's the one that has a stronger link to the Syrian National Coalition. The rebels that are of the Islamist variety are not prepared to accept any terms under Geneva 2, and I think that that's probably going to mean that even if we do have some sort of international negotiation agreement in Geneva 2, the chances of it being implemented on the ground are really quite narrow.
So in terms of these rifts or these rivalries between various factions, how is that serving as an obstacle to some kind of negotiated settlement? Does that work in Assad's favor, or does that just make things just incredibly complicated?
Well, it does work in Assad's favor because at the moment Assad doesn't have a real counterpoint or a counterpoint person to really negotiate on behalf of the opposition. So that's been, a challenge increasingly in the past year. It wasn't necessarily at the beginning because the Syrian National Coalition, I think, initially, effectively, and then particularly when they were able to align themselves with the Free Syrian Army, were able to say that they had some, not only territorial control, but more importantly, that they spoke for people on the ground fighting against the regime. Increasingly, what's happening is that the Syrian National Coalition is completely divorced, if you will, from those rebels that have gained territory from Assad. Assad as well has also increasingly gained some territory himself, won back a few areas, particularly around some villages around Aleppo, and more importantly, he looks stronger. He looks more capable, thanks to, in particular, Hezbollah, who's come to his aid. We know that there are many Iranian soldiers and Revolutionary Guards that have come to help as well. That's been, I guess, a refreshment of troops for Assad. And so he's actually winning on the ground tactically, and I think increasingly morally on the international level. The rebels are no longer the secular Free Syrian Army, and increasingly we hear about human rights violations committed by the ISIS and other al-Qaeda forces, so that's diminishing the moral stature, if you will, of the opposition itself.
And for the countries that want to bring an end to this conflict, how do they navigate with whom to align themselves? 'Cause it seems like the piece is just moving constantly, and power dynamics are changing constantly.
They are. There's been this unfortunate sort of Cold War in the Arab world that's been exposed, and some take it along sort of sectarian lines. And so there seems to be this camp that's being dominated by the Iranians in alliance with Syria, as well as Iraq, as well as perhaps Hezbollah. And then you have also the so-called Sunni alliance led by Saudi Arabia, many of the Gulf countries, and increasingly many of the Western countries that support those Gulf countries. So there seems to be this kind of sectarian division that's taking place. But I think that more interestingly is to see that those who sort of agree with the idea that a government doesn't have a right to kill its own civilians in order to maintain order and its own longevity are the ones opposing the Assad regime, and those that believe in the so-called sanctity of the sovereignty of the state, like Russia and Iran and the rest, tend to be the ones to support the Assad regime.
Right. Thank you very much. This is great. I want to come back to this in the second portion of the episode. We'll be back in a moment with Dr. Bessma Momani. You are watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CG Online podcast. Look for us online, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Welcome back to the program. Bessma, I'd like to get your thoughts on the international community's efforts to remove the chemical weapons from Syria, and whether or not you think they can ultimately be successful.
Well, it's really interesting to see how much of this has been a multilateral affair. Indeed, what we've seen is this great effort at the United Nations finally to come up with a UN Security Council resolution to agree that the chemical weapons would be removed. And every other effort to try and censure Assad has been for naught, basically. What we've seen here is basically the Assad government take these to the Latakia ports, put them on Norwegian and Dutch ships. Both Russian and Chinese naval ships, warships, have been escorting that particular Danish and Norwegian ships. Then they go to a port in Italy. At the moment, there is some complication with landing in Italy, but nevertheless, that's the plan. From Italy, they will go onto a American ship that will then take the chemical weapons out into the open seas and process those chemical weapons using a sort of hydrolysis process to basically take out what are the chemicals that are most lethal, and have those actually transported to Germany for industrial processing, some to the United States for industrial processing, and the rest would be somehow emitted into the water. That's safe content to be put into the water. So it really does involve a lot of different flags in order to ensure the successful implementation of this. I'm confident that it'll eventually happen because there's so much determination at this point. You can see there's a lot of countries involved, a lot of money, perhaps costing as high as $1 billion to actually implement. It's a coup for the international community to get Assad to turn over these weapons. It's an enormous amount that'll take it out of his arsenal. But I do think that needs to be pointed out is that 1,600 people died, as horrible as that was, at the hands of Assad for using those chemical weapons. We've had 100,000 more die through conventional means. So it does not take away the most potent, if you will, instrument that Assad has used in the past.
Well, and I wanted to follow up on this point. I mean, the human rights groups were saying well before the reports of the use of chemical weapons came out that war crimes and crimes against humanity were being committed in Syria. They've obviously continued after the government has stopped using or the forces have stopped using chemical weapons. Does this really change anything on the ground, the removal of the chemical weapons, despite how significant it is for the reasons that you mentioned before? But in terms of for Syrians on the ground, does this change anything?
Well, in one respect, it's great that these are now being confiscated and turned over to international community, because it does prevent their future use. And the thing that makes chemical weapons so hideous is that they're so indiscriminate. They kill the vulnerable, they kill anybody who's asleep, they tend to hurt children because it settles to the ground. I mean, it's a terrible instrument that's obviously one of the worst kinds of things we can see in any war. But I do think that the reality is most people are being killed from the skies by the regime. Aerial assaults are high, Scud missiles thrown into areas, and those are all indiscriminate as well. That's why we've seen such a high death toll here. We have had 40,000 civilians, 11,000 that are children. There's a reason why many families are leaving Syria in droves. So it doesn't really take away the urgency of trying to find a solution to this crisis. But it does, I think, take an important instrument that is horrible at that from his arsenal.
Right. Speaking of options and instruments, several groups and human rights groups and even states have called for the situation in Syria to be referred to the International Criminal Court, which of course is yet to happen. But do you think that someday in the future someone will be held to account for the crimes, and of course the crimes on both sides being committed by the government forces and by the rebel forces? Do you think anyone will ever be brought before some tribunal, either at the national level in another country or potentially at the International Criminal Court?
Well, I hope so. I guess on a moral level, I think that's really important, so that people don't think that they're immune. The challenge of that, of course, is that Syria is not a member of the ICC. Right. And the other issue is, I don't think Assad will ever sign any sort of transition deal. So if this is going to be done through some sort of negotiated solution, one of the key things that he will want to do is have immunity. Now, obviously, that won't just be for himself. It'll be for a large amount of people in his upper echelons of the war machine who've committed all these atrocities. The good news is there is a strong effort to report everything. And one of the things that I'm really proud of in terms of the Syrian people that they've been able to do, particularly at the civil society level, is not only document every atrocity, find out who may have been responsible. There's a lot of, I think, intelligence being gathered at the moment, even by civil society actors, to try and have this logbook ready so that when and if the day comes, they are able to do something about it. Can it be done retroactively? As we saw, for example, in the case of General Pinochet, where a country, even they have such a thing as constitutionally as Pinochet did, have some sort of immunity, still be brought forward to some sort of international tribunal or some court. That's possible, and I think that's the biggest fear that Assad has at this moment. And perhaps one could even argue it's one of the barriers to finding a negotiated solution, because Assad and his cronies around him who have blood on their hands are very much fearful of the day after. What happens to them? Even if they were to hand over power, would they be able to spend the rest of their days on the coast of Latakia, as perhaps many of them would want to, right, and not necessarily behind bars? That's a big issue. It's a moral issue. It's one that I think Syrians will have to judge. History is not a great lesson on that. We have everything from the Truth and Reconciliation process, which opens the conversation, but doesn't necessarily lead to the kinds of convictions that people want. Right. And then we have other examples where indeed, people were taken to international courts, particularly in Yugoslavia. That was obviously an important part of the process and the part of moving on. I think the fact is, though, Assad still has support in the country, and so perhaps he will be able to, I think, get some sort of immunity in exchange of sort of this transfer of power. But I think that the Syrian people will ultimately be the ones to decide that.
Great. Thank you very much. We will be back in a moment. You are watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CG Online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Welcome back to the program. Bessma, I'd like to shift our focus from Syria to Egypt. Mm-hmm. And I'd like to start by asking you about the Egyptian constitution, which has been a tremendously controversial part of the post-Mubarak era in Egypt, both for former President Morsi and for the interim government. For the benefit of our audience, what are the controversies surrounding the Constitution, and why has this been such a big obstacle for Egyptians in terms of moving forward?
I think the biggest obstacle and real controversy is in who's writing the Constitution. That's been the biggest problem. Both the 2012 and the 2014 version are very similar to the 1971 version. I mean, they're really similar. And so we're really talking about minor changes. The 2012 one was written by a committee appointed by Morsi. And the committee basically rushed right to the very end to get a constitution passed before it was overthrown by the judiciary. And that was really the controversy there. Even though, again, it was through a referendum passed, again with a low turnout, but nevertheless it was passed. I think the controversy on that was references to the status of women, and it wasn't necessarily undermining their status. It was very interesting. It was actually looking at whether or not the state had a right to provide a woman, childcare and other kinds of accommodations in order to fulfill her duties as both mother and as a productive member of society. And if you took a very liberal interpretation of that, you could find judiciary who would say, well, that means you have the right to state daycare. So
right.
It could, it's all about interpretation. So I have to be very clear here that the Constitution itself is only as good as the judiciary that actually implements it. But nevertheless, that was one. There was references to Islamic law, which still remains. That has not been removed. There was a reference to, if there's any questions about Islamic law, to go to Al-Azhar University, which is the highest order in Sunni Islam, to interpret Islamic law. The reference to Islamic laws remains, but the reference to Al-Azhar has been removed. Other controversies that I think really stand out is the sort of the role of the military. From the 2012 version to the 2014 version, we have even more entrenched rights and autonomy for the military. The military can't be questioned, its budget can't be questioned. Anyone who harms the interest of the military can be rounded up. The police have more powers, judiciary have more powers. All of the elements of, if you will, the remnants of the Mubarak regime are actually strengthened by the 2014 version. But more importantly, the controversy is about who wrote it. This is now a committee of 50 that wrote this constitution. Again, very little difference from the last one, other than to add more entrenched rights for the institutions like the military, judiciary, and police. But what's interesting here is that this committee did not include any Islamists, which, as we know, in the case of Muslim Brotherhood, won democratically the presidential elections in 2012. So it's I think, a very interesting reflection of the kinds of polarization in Egyptian society today. But more importantly, I think these are either both two constitutions that are very similar to each other, but I think we're moving backwards in the sense of having more entrenched rights for these institutions.
Right. There are elections scheduled for 2014. There are many political parties in Egypt, none that can really claim a national mandate. How do you see the elections playing out?
Well, I mean, you really hit it on the nail. I mean, there aren't a lot of really big, strong political parties, and the one that had existed, basically the Muslim Brotherhood and their Freedom and Justice Party, were the ones that won the last election, because they really had the human resources on the ground, the soldiers, so to speak, who can go out there and recruit and campaign, and therefore people could vote for. The challenge we have now is there's a lot of Egyptian parties, but they're all very small, fragmented. They don't necessarily have well-known leaders, even in many cases, with the exception of perhaps a few. I think the challenge has been for all of the Egyptian political parties is to really break out and be known for their ideology, and not just for one or two individuals in the organization. The presidential elections that are coming up, that's going to probably be first before the parliamentary elections. That's kind of what we've been getting hinted at by Al-Sisi and others in the government, who have pointed to the requirement of having the constitution first and then having the presidential. Sisi is clearly going to run. I think that there's no doubt in anyone's mind. There is a love fest with Sisi at the moment in Egypt. People adore him and want him to run. I think that he will easily win, even though I think that the kinds of policies that are come from a person like Sisi and the whole military establishment will probably be to the chagrin of many liberals who are going to see more freedoms curtailed, more individual rights curtailed. And unfortunately, this is the time in Egypt where, after experiencing, even though it was a democratic elected government under Morsi, who pretty much mismanaged the economy particularly, they're going to be very much in favor of returning back to some sort of normalcy and economic stability, but I'm afraid it's a step backward, a very step backward for the Egyptian political system.
And on that note, if the elections don't go well, if they're highly contested, if there are problems with process and with transparency, what are the implications for democracy in Egypt, both in the short term and moving forward, if the elections don't go well?
Well, speaking on the presidential, I don't think anybody would dare oppose Sisi.
Right.
Nobody's willing to actually challenge him. Not only is there fear that you might end up in jail, that's something that we're seeing all opposition journalists now in Egypt. It's a very troubling time. We have a Canadian journalist in prison right now. So it's clearly not a good time for those who want to challenge the establishment. You will find yourself literally in prison. So I think that the fact that we have General Sisi being the only man on the ticket is going to really shape the future of Egyptian democracy, unfortunately, until we have major changes. I don't see, the kind of free democratic process come to fruition like we saw in 2012. I think that looks like it's going to be another hard battle for many liberal and civil society activists to regain, I think, the confidence of the people to try democracy again. And so the parliamentary elections, once they're announced, and I think that after the presidential, there is a plan several months later to have a parliamentary election, which clearly I think the president will have a lot of powers then to basically shape and control. We'll probably see the Freedom and Justice Party be eliminated. At the moment, the Muslim Brotherhood has been designed or designated as a terrorist group, but not the Freedom and Justice Party. Eventually, I believe that will be an issue. We've already seen in the Constitution an expectation that political party cannot run on the principles of religion. All political parties must be secular. That hasn't prevented the Muslim Brotherhood from attempting to post people as independents, as we saw in 2005 and other places as well throughout the Arab and Muslim world. But nevertheless, I think we're going to see the FJP or their supporters really pull back and not participate. The one that made challenges the Sisi is the Noor party, the Salafist party, which ironically make the Muslim Brotherhood look very, very moderate. Right. So we're actually emboldening the radicals, if you will. The Salafist Noor party last time took 25% of the popular vote. Wow. That's a very large amount. Would they be the party that gets to basically really rein in the dominant Islamist voice? That's a possibility, but then the real challenge is that after that, there are no real big liberal parties out there, short of maybe the National Salvation Front, but they're disjointed. They have on their own 17 potential leaders. Right. Just shows you how the field is very much fragmented.
Wow. Thank you very much. We will be back in a moment. You are watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CG Online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on YouTube, and on Twitter. Welcome back to the program. Bessma, I'd like to pick up on the last point about the elections and the fractured nature of politics in Egypt. Mm-hmm. And of course, as you noted, the Muslim Brotherhood has been excluded from the political process now. What are the real implications of that for politics in Egypt?
Well, the real worry is that, and I think it's a valid one, is that somehow if you have the Muslim Brotherhood completely alienated from politics, you basically drive them underground. And that doesn't help the security situation. Even though the Muslim Brotherhood has declared long ago that they are against violence. This is a large organization. It perhaps has membership of up to 8 million people in Egypt. You cannot control that there may not be cells that basically say to amongst each other that the political process, democracy doesn't work clearly. We need to use alternative means to get our ideological agenda out there and resort to violence. It's a possibility. This is the challenge of democracy, is to give people a pluralistic option to participate in the democratic process. When you disallow or basically prevent that, the fear is that they will use alternate means to have their voices heard. And so the fear is that they will become, not just when, but it's not just if, but when will they turn to be more violent? And I think that's a real concern for many people. And I think it's unfortunately it could have been so different. I think many of us who are in support of democracy in Egypt would have said, if only the opposition waited, and if only the Egyptian people waited for 3 years till there was an actual democracy again, the Muslim Brotherhood would have lost so much popularity that they would have eventually, discredited their agenda, and you would have had a peaceful transition. But now we've made them into, a victimist, a group that's victims, which is a narrative that they very much, thrive on ideologically, but more importantly allows splinter groups and cells to basically form more extremist measures, and that's not healthy for the security of Egypt or for the region.
Right. Do you think the international community will support whoever wins the elections? Or will there be a kind of a lukewarm reaction the way there was when Morsi was elected?
Well, I think we're seeing the changing already in terms of the tides are turning more into the positive. One of the first things the Americans did was suspend foreign aid to Egypt, particularly because the military is the largest recipient of foreign aid. They get $1 billion in U.S. foreign aid per year. They suspended that. In fact, they've just resumed it just recently in mid-January. So I think that's a sign that, in fact, the international community is warming up to this. Really, Al-Sisi, in his call for people to come out for the referendum, was really about trying to say that I need you to show the international community that this referendum is not just about the Constitution, but also about your endorsement of my policies, Sisi's policies, of the military coming in and overtaking the Muslim Brotherhood and Morsi. And they haven't released how much the turnout is, and we're not really confident that these were free and fair elections, particularly because so many of the opposition were in jail, but more importantly, no real monitors were really present to really know for sure. But already we're hearing claims of 90% yes vote, and really, I think, falsified numbers in terms of turnout. Regardless, I think the truth of the matter is that this was not a free and fair election, and that's the basis of the problem. But nevertheless, I think the international community wants to kind of move on, and short of a few allies or former allies, countries, perhaps like the Turkey, perhaps I could think of a few others here and there throughout the world that want to sort of continue the pressure on Egypt. The vast majority just want to move on, and so they're willing to sort of forget. I think that the Americans are probably the biggest and most important country in moving forward, because they're the biggest patron of the Egyptian army and the Egyptian government generally with aid. So they've seemed to turn the corner and sort of say, let's just move forward and get on with it. The international financial community is still not feeling safe and comfortable, so we haven't seen a resumption of investment, although that said, the Gulf has put a lot of money into Egypt to try and bring back the financial sector.
And just on that last point, post-election, is the economy the #1 priority for the government and getting that back on track?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very technocratic government. Many economists in the prime minister is actually an economist. So there is an attempt to focus on the economy, but the economy is dependent on things like tourism. 25% of the economy is based on tourism. Tourists are not going to Egypt at the moment in high numbers, obviously, because of all the insecurity. So it's going to be really difficult to turn that corner. And again, we're seeing a lot of Gulf money come into putting money in the coffers of the banks and helping the stock exchange and so forth, but not really investing in projects per se in Egypt. And that's really an important part. This is a country that has a large surplus labor, a lot of people that are unemployed, a very young population. It needs jobs, a lot of jobs. And the manufacturing sector has been hurt enormously by the fact that we've had not only currency volatility in the country, but also a real loss of confidence in investment. And I think that as long as you have a political contentious situation, the security situation will be just as tense, and therefore you won't have the investment that you need. So, it's going to take a lot for this existing government to really, I think, change the mood about Egypt. And I think so long as internally in the country, people don't feel confident in the government, and no matter what, you still have at least 10% of the population that are diehard supporters of Morsi, who feel that they have been robbed of a democratic elected government.
Right.
That's a lot of people to disturb the peace, if you will, and to be very unhappy from within.
Right. Well, thank you so much, Bessma. This has been wonderful. And thank you to our audience for watching. You have been watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CG Online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on YouTube, on Facebook, and on Twitter. In international public policy, global governance, or some other aspect of international affairs. Today, we're joined by Dr. Bessma Momani. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Dr. Momani is a senior fellow here at the Center for International Governance and Innovation, and associate professor of political science at the University of Waterloo. I wonder if we might start with the situation in Syria.
Mm-hmm.
As you know, the conflict has been going on since 2011. Is there any end in sight to the violence, at least in the short term?
Well, I probably don't have a crystal ball, but I think that there are, some would say, some positive signs and some negative signs. Let's start with that. I guess on the positive side, we're seeing a coordinated effort at the international level. Both the Russian Sergei Lavrov as well as John Kerry have really put a lot of personal investment into this. We're seeing now the coming to terms of perhaps including the Iranians as well, at least as an observer status in the negotiations, in the discussions coming up in Geneva 2, set to take place on January 22nd. So that some would point to as a positive thing. Perhaps there may be some pressure, particularly on from the United States, on the Syrian National Council or coalition to actually attend. So that all sounds as though maybe there's hope, and I've heard of rumors of things as humanitarian corridors or safe zones for people, perhaps a ceasefire in Aleppo and other areas. These are all potential good signs or good things. The negative is that, in fact, the Syrian National Coalition probably doesn't have a lot of control on the ground. And in fact, what we're seeing on the rise is increasingly sort of a warlord kind of situation where many different little cities and towns and villages are being run by different kinds of militias that are not under any central control. We've had increasingly the rise of Al-Qaeda forces. These are not necessarily directly tied to Al-Qaeda, but they're sort of affiliates, or they're almost like a franchise of Al-Qaeda, particularly ISIS, the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, and to a lesser extent Al-Nusra Front, which is also an Al-Qaeda affiliate. And these two have taken on a greater amount of control, particularly in the eastern part of Syria. And some would say that's awfully troubling. Obviously, it does mean that there's less territory under the control of the rebels that are of the secular Free Syrian Army, and that's the one that has a stronger link to the Syrian National Coalition. The rebels that are of the Islamist variety are not prepared to accept any terms under Geneva 2, and I think that that's probably going to mean that even if we do have some sort of international negotiation agreement in Geneva 2, the chances of it being implemented on the ground are really quite narrow.
So in terms of these rifts or these rivalries between various factions, how is that serving as an obstacle to some kind of negotiated settlement? Does that work in Assad's favor, or does that just make things just incredibly complicated?
Well, it does work in Assad's favor because at the moment Assad doesn't have a
Today on Inside the Issues, I speak to Dr. Bessma Momani about the ongoing conflicts in Syria and Egypt. Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Inside the Issues, a CG Online podcast. My name is Dr. Andrew Thompson. I'm an adjunct assistant professor of political science at the University of Waterloo and program officer at the Balsley School of International Affairs. Every week on the program, we're joined by an expert